One of the first things we have to do is safely raise and support the rear of the truck, and then of course we're going to remove all of our lug nuts and then the wheel. Go ahead and remove our caliper to caliper slider bolts. There's going to be 2 of them. We need to get them both out of there. Remove your caliper. Get this off of there. Now you're going to want to inspect your caliper. If you see any fluid that looks like it's coming out of this boot right here, that means that you have to replace your caliper. As you can tell, this one's been leaking for a while. It needs to be replaced. Let's go ahead and get these pads out of here. There we are. Now the next thing we need to do is remove our caliper bracket bolts. Now the next thing we're going to do is take one of our lug nuts and start it onto one of the lug studs. After you've done that, let's continue on by removing the rotor. Alright, so now the next thing we need to do is go ahead and remove this line from this bracket right here. Ours is very rotted, so I'm going to end up having to cut it. Before I go ahead and cut right along this area though, I'm just going to go ahead and cut the e-brake cable right here. This is going to be the cable that we're replacing that goes to the right rear. Now that I have that off, I can continue on by trimming the rest of this. Now with that off and out of the way, let's continue on to removing this part. There's going to be some little squeeze tabs that come along it. You can either break those off or just use a tool that looks like this, press them all in, and then remove the cable. Now that we've got this nice and freed up, let's continue on to removing it from the differential. Now we can follow it down to this area right here. We're going to go ahead and squeeze those tabs or break them off, and then we'll get this off of this e-brake pivot. Now if we just go ahead and work on this a little bit, we can go ahead and pull that e-brake pivot right out of there. All right, let's go ahead and get the cable out of here. Now let's start removing it from the truck. There it is, friends. Okay, so now it's time to get ready for our install. I'm just going to go ahead and take this cable, I'm going to come right through this area right here and bring it up. The next thing we're going to do is bring it right through this area with the bracket, slide it through, and then we're going to lock it in. Okay, so now let's go ahead and slide this through. We'll start our washer on there, and then of course our nut. Okay, so now that I've got that started, let's move along to the other side. Now you want to make sure that you go around the back side of your flex hose. There we are. Of course, if you were to go around the front side, that's going to be putting extra pressure on that flex hose. There we are. Make sure that's secured. Now let's go ahead and take this along the forward side of your shock, up and over the leaf spring, and then in through right here. Go ahead and lock it in. There we are. Now, if you had some brand new boots for this, obviously it would be a great idea to go ahead and replace these. That said, let's go ahead and put the little ear through, put our cable on there, and make sure it's secure. Okay, now the next thing we're going to want to do is go ahead and clean down our mating surface of our axle, so that way there when we put on the rotor, it'll sit flush. Let's go ahead and use a little bit of copper never sees along this area here. Now we need to take a look right down here to the emergency brake adjuster. This is something that we're going to have to adjust to make sure that the e-brake shoe is close enough to the rotor without actually necessarily touching it. And give it a nice little turn like this. Now at this point, we're just going to listen for a little bit of friction. I don't really hear anything, so that means that my shoes need to be adjusted out a little bit. So for the driver's side, I'm just going to go ahead and grab onto this, and I'm going to turn it clockwise. That's going to end up pushing out the shoe a little bit, so let's go ahead and grab the rotor and try again. Now at this point, I can hear a tiny bit of drag, but I definitely don't feel any resistance on the rotor. If you hear drag and you have resistance, then that means that you're a little bit too tight. Now back over at the truck, let's continue by putting on our caliper bracket with our caliper bracket bolts. I always like to use a little bit of red thread locker on these. We'll go ahead and snug them up, and then we'll torque them to 52 foot-pounds. Okay, now it's going to be time to put on our brake pads. What you're going to notice is you have wear indicators on them. We want to essentially line these up so we have the wear indicators both facing on the same side here. Let's put the top area in, line up the bottom, and put that in as well. You should feel these be able to flow nicely. Do the same for the outer pad. That feels good. Now let's take our caliper, slide it right over those pads, push in on the sliders so we can slide the caliper over it, and then of course we'll put on our slider bolts with a little bit of red thread locker. Okay, now let's go ahead and snug them up and torque them to 23 foot-pounds. I'm going to hold the slider so it doesn't spin and snug it up. Let's go ahead and get the wheel up on here, hopefully. Start on all of our lug nuts, we'll snug them up, and then we'll get it on the ground and torque them to 100 foot-pounds. Torqued. Of course, if you have your lug nut covers, let's go ahead and make sure we put those on as well. There we are. Now all you have left to do is go ahead and pump up the brake pedal, check your master cylinder for your brake fluid, and of course, take it for a road test.